Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this panel discussion reflecting on the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act. My name is Mel Flyte. I'm an assistant curator with Sydney Living Museums. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of the land upon which I'm coming to you today, and respectfully acknowledge the enduring connection of Indigenous peoples to country across this nation. I'm going to extend a very warm welcome to any First Nations people joining us today. I'm really thrilled to be joined today by two very knowledgeable speakers, and I'll introduce them both to you now. First of all, I'd like to introduce Alastair Lawrie. Alastair is a senior policy officer with the Public Interest Advocacy Centre, working across a range of their projects with a focus on anti-discrimination law reform, including modernising of the Anti-Discrimination Act. He also works on asylum seeker health rights, Indigenous constitutional recognition, and police accountability. Alastair has over 16 years' experience in public policy in roles such as the Policy and Engagement Manager at Hepatitis New South Wales and as the Policy and Law Reform Officer at Victoria Legal Aid. He is a mentor with the Pinnacle Foundation, which provides educational scholarships, mentoring and opportunities for young LGBTQI+ Australians, and sits on the Social Justice Committee of the Sydney Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras Board. In 2017, Alastair was a finalist in the Tony Fitzgerald Memorial Community Individual category at the Australian Human Rights Awards. Recently, he has authored the report Leader to Laggard, the case for modernising the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act. Thank you for joining us today, Alastair.
Thanks very much for having me.
I'd also like to welcome Dr Eloise Brook. Eloise is the Health and Communications Manager at the Gender Centre, the peak statewide multidisciplinary centre of excellence, providing a broad range of specialised services that enables the exploration of gender identity and assistance with the alleviation of gender dysphoria. Eloise has a PhD from the University of Technology in Queensland and has written about trans issues for The Conversation, Overland and Archer magazine. Her work includes developing ways to empower the trans community to engage with the Australian media in more positive ways. She is a researcher and lecturer in political science and gender studies and host and producer for the Gender Centre's podcast, Counting the Dead. Eloise was a member of the reference group for the Australian Bureau of Statistics Standards for sex, gender, variation of sex characteristics and sexual orientation variables. Welcome, Eloise. Thank you for joining us as well today.
Thank you for having me.
I'll just begin today by contextualising our discussion about the Anti-Discrimination Act of New South Wales as part of the History Reflected exhibition, which sadly, due to COVID, we haven't been able to open to the public, but I'm pretty excited to be able to announce that we are working behind the scenes to be able to bring this exhibition to you at some stage next year. So do stay tuned on our website for more information. But I'll just run through the kind of concept of the exhibition. It was conceived as a way of celebrating the partnership between Sydney Living Museums and the New South Wales State Archives and Records Authority, and to celebrate the storytelling potential of both organisations. Dr Penny Stannard, Head of Curatorial for SLM and SARA, selected 25 items from the State Archives collection to form the exhibition, and asked the curatorial team at Sydney Living Museums, as well as a number of external contributors, to respond to these items with a contemporary voice to reflect on its meaning today. The items selected span a period of over 213 years, from 1787 to the year 2000. Each item selected provides a tangible link to a social moment, a cultural phenomenon, or a moment of change that affected the people of New South Wales, essentially a link to a ground-breaking moment in New South Wales history. And the contemporary responses explore questions about who we are, what we believe and understand about ourselves and others, our values and hopes, and how we express ourselves. So the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act was one of the items that I was assigned to explore and research. And as I began researching the Act, a couple of things really struck me. I think the first thing that struck me was that at the time of its creation in 1977, it was extremely groundbreaking and progressive in terms of Australian law. It came on the back of many, many movements that were, I suppose, trying to dismantle laws and practices in our society that had discriminated against women, minority groups, and Indigenous peoples. Drafted in 1977, it came only sort of 2 years after the Commonwealth Racial Discrimination Act, for instance. And the Act was created to prohibit forms of racial, sexual, or marital discrimination in employment, accommodation, goods and services, and education. Subsequent amendments include protection for homosexuals, people with disabilities, and transgender people to prevent discrimination on the basis of age and your status as a carer. But I suppose the second thing that really struck me about the Act in 2021, despite the numerous amendments, the Act now lags behind other states and other countries in the protections that it provides for all sections of our society, particularly in relation to LGBTQI plus issues and protections afforded to certain sections of our community. I contacted Alastair last year to kind of help me unpack some of the complicated and quite often contradictory language that is part of the Act, and to provide a sort of informed commentary on the shortcomings of the ADA today. So Alastair, I might jump to you first. Does the original intention of the Act still hold true in 2021?
Thanks very much. I think the original intention of the Act is still worthwhile. I think, unfortunately, the Act doesn't meet its original intention. So the core function of an Anti-Discrimination Act is to prevent and to respond to discrimination in everyday life. Importantly, it doesn't address all types of mistreatment in public. So, for example, it only applies to discrimination on the basis of particular protected attributes like race or sex or age. Therefore, who isn't covered by the Act reveals a lot about the values of the New South Wales government and of the community more broadly, including how those values change over time. Unfortunately, the Act hasn't changed with our values. So, as you pointed out in the introduction, it started out quite strongly. It was the first Act in the country that applied to more than one protected attribute. So, as you noted, it applied to race and sex and marital status. And even in the early 1980s, the rate of expansion was quite significant. So it applied to disability from 1981, responsibilities as a carer from 1982, and also to homosexuality from 1982. Now, that was the first in the country to do so. And in fact, it was so early that for 18 months, you could be, as a gay man in New South Wales, you could be protected from discrimination in employment and housing, but you could still be subjected to imprisonment for having consensual sex in private, because homosexuality wasn't decriminalised until mid-1984. So the values at the time were that you should not be subjected to discrimination in public on the basis of who you are. Unfortunately, what we've seen since then is that the rate of progress in terms of expanding to different groups has slowed significantly. So we had age, which was added in 1993, and then transgender, which was added in 1996. And it was the last major new attribute to be added to the Act. And we'll talk more about that attribute later. What that means is that for 25 years, the Act hasn't expanded. It hasn't caught up in terms of who we as a society think should be protected from discrimination in terms of their daily life, in terms of employment and education and transport, in goods and services. And so then that's the flip side. What do the values say about who we are excluding? And in terms of the LGBTI community, we're excluding significant proportions of it, and three in particular. So the Act protects homosexuals, and it says male or female homosexual. On that basis, it doesn't protect bisexuals, and it's the only anti-discrimination law in the country that doesn't protect bisexuals. Interestingly, for the same reason, it doesn't protect heterosexuals either. Again, the only place in the country. As we'll discuss more, the definition of transgender, while it was progressive at the time in 1996, now seems quite limited in that it only protects people with very binary gender identities and not people who are non-binary or have other gender diverse forms of identity. And finally, it doesn't protect people with innate variations of sex characteristics. So this is a newer ground of anti-discrimination, first introduced in the Commonwealth in 2013. But since then, we've seen it introduced in the Commonwealth, in Tasmania, in the ACT, in South Australia, and Victoria. But New South Wales hasn't protected intersex people either. And so I guess what I'd say to that is people who are bisexual, people who are non-binary, people who are intersex are not seen, according to this law, and therefore by implication, according to the government, as being as valuable as other members of society, including even lesbians, gay men, and some other transgender people.
Thanks, Alastair. That's a really fascinating kind of breakdown on some of the categories. Eloise, I might just jump to you next, because Alastair really touched on a few issues with definitions of trans people. And I think from your work, you're probably best placed to answer a question about a lot of the press that's been relating to trans and gender diverse issues over about the last sort of 12 months. We've seen a real increase in that. We've seen examples such as the controversial ban on trans women from Mackay Baths in Coogee in January this year, and also a lot of debate around the current education legislation amendment bill that's being discussed in New South Wales Parliament at the moment. I'm sure in your work with the Gender Centre, you see the impact of the shortcomings of the Act on trans and gender diverse people. How important is it that gender diversity is protected by these state laws and not just sort of sexual identity?
I guess it really comes down to, and building on some of the things that Alastair was saying, is that why have policy? Why have anti-discrimination if it doesn't actually fulfil the role of stopping people from being discriminated against? And so that means that, as you know, especially specifically for trans people, over time, as definitions broaden or our understanding of what constitutes a trans person has changed over the last 70 years, it often has meant big shifts in our general understanding of notions of gender and identity. And so legislation isn't keeping up with those kinds of those changes or realizations that the community makes. So legislation that comes out in 1976 that broadly protects a class of people that is understood to be trans or transgender in 76 looks nothing like what a group of trans people might look like in 96 or in 2001. So even from a sheerly practical perspective, the legislation is like as a small blanket that just keeps getting smaller and leaving more and more of the trans community out in the cold. And the list, you know, there's a growing list of how it is failing to kind of help the community. In regard to the Mackay Baths stuff, I think this is a good example of the kinds of kind of cultural or moral panics you know, that come along with shifts and change about our understanding of gender and identity. It's worth mentioning that when you look at the history, not just in Australia, but internationally as well, you have these, the history of legislation changes, and you have these pockets, or you often have these pockets where the wider understanding of what a trans person is not really understood widely by the community. And often legislation that gets passed at the time is really quite progressive. Some of the legislation changes that were made in the past, from looking back from 2021, we go, wow, how did they actually get that through? If it was the current environment, there is no way we would have got that through. And so it's really fascinating to see how sometimes policy development and awareness of trans and gender diverse people often align in particular ways to either, for instance, provide a policy that is quite progressive for its time, or as I guess we're seeing in 2021, you know, potentially quite regressive as well, as a broader kind of moral panic around trans people puts pressure on the policy making process to kind of tighten the screws and restrict things even more. So the McIver bath issue is a pretty good example of the way that a general kind of moral panic around trans women and bathrooms that has been brought in from overseas and mapped over the Coogee bars and the Coogee community, even though, you know, we the Gender Centre kind of talks to a lot of community members and the wider community. We, you know, at Coogee, we know that the baths themselves, which provide a service or have provided a service for women for over 100 years, the individual members themselves are quite outraged at the furor around excluding trans women. So you get, you know, 70 and 80-year-old kind of these wonderful old ladies who are horrified by the treatment that trans women experience, or the kinds of exclusion that have gone on. And when you burrow down at the community level, it looks very different from this general kind of media snapshot that we get that's very kind of coloured by the politics of the time.
Thank you. Alastair, you've recently published a report, Leader to Laggard, that outlines ways in which the Anti-Discrimination Act could be updated. Could you expand a little bit more on the main issues with our current Act and the kind of recommendations that you've put forward? And maybe even unwrap some of the processes around making an amendment to an Act such as this. It's been 25 years since an amendment was made to the Anti-Discrimination Act. You know, I think that's potentially a really good sign that laws are not keeping up with changes in society.
Sure, I think there's probably enough content in that question to get through the rest of the panel, but I'll try my best. So in our report, we really tried to look at the main problems with the Act, and they are wide-ranging and serious. And so we've already talked a little bit about the attributes and who's included and excluded. One of the other serious problems with the New South Wales Act is the breadth of the exceptions that it includes. So I think most people will be familiar with religious exceptions, which allow for religious organisations to discriminate in terms of employment, in terms of who they provide services to. New South Wales has quite broad religious exceptions allowing that discrimination, but it also has something that's unique in the context of Australia, and that's the private educational authority exceptions, which allow private schools to discriminate even where those schools are not religious. And they can do that on all attributes other than, all the major attributes other than race. So sex, homosexuality, transgender, and even disability. So private schools can discriminate to their heart's content against disabled children in New South Wales, and there's nothing you can do in terms of the New South Wales Act. You can still complain under Commonwealth legislation. So that's one area, and we can probably come back to the area of LGBT students later if we have time. There are some other serious limitations that we've tried to highlight. One is that sexual harassment, which is also something that is covered under the Anti-Discrimination Act, was introduced in New South Wales in 1997, and it hasn't been touched since. And I think our understandings of sexual harassment have certainly changed a lot in the last 24 years. The Human Rights Commission's Respect at Work report last year provided a pretty comprehensive roadmap for how these laws should be improved, including the need to provide a positive obligation on employers to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace. Unfortunately, the Commonwealth Government didn't introduce that in its recently passed legislative package, despite the opposition and Greens trying to move amendments to do so. There's actually nothing to stop the New South Wales Government itself from introducing a positive obligation under New South Wales law. So if, as a society, we think that women should be protected against sexual harassment in the workplace, then that's another area where the New South Wales Anti-Discrimination Act should be updated. Probably a third area is in the issue of reasonable adjustments for people with disability. So some legislation across the country, including the Commonwealth Disability Discrimination Act, imposes a reasonable adjustments requirement on employers and others to assist people with disability participate in society. Unfortunately, a federal court decision in a case called Squavos has really limited its application. And despite PAC advocating with People with Disability Australia and others to the Commonwealth Government, they're yet to fix that. Once again, this is an issue that could be addressed in the New South Wales Act. There's currently no obligation to provide reasonable adjustments in the New South Wales Act, but there's no reason why that couldn't be if the government wanted to. One other issue, and people might be surprised that I'm raising this, is there is a gap in terms of the protection of religious belief. It's an area where all other states and territories except South Australia have protected, and obviously the Commonwealth hasn't yet either for various reasons. The problem is that we end up with proposals like the extremist One Nation Religious Freedom Bill, which would prioritise religious belief over the rights of others. As I kind of commented at the beginning, we see anti-discrimination legislation as laws that prevent or respond to discrimination. Religious freedom laws instead promote new ways of discriminating against others and privilege discrimination against others. So we would like to see religious belief protected, but on the same basis as other attributes and not undermining the rights of other groups in the community. I don't know whether you want me to stop there or to go on in terms of amendments, but that's probably enough at this point.
Yeah, look, maybe we might come back to that process of amendments, because I think it's sort of an interesting one to see how infrequently they do happen. But Eloise, I might just jump back to you and just sort of go back to that issue about the kind of public debate versus what's actually happening in society about trans and gender diverse issues. And quite often the public debate about trans issues is really focused on the kind of legitimacy of trans people, as opposed to the fact that there are issues that they face and they shouldn't have to justify their existence. So how important is it to sort of reframe the discussions around trans issues to be more inclusive, and how do we kind of go about that on the back of, say, examples such as our latest census really missing the opportunity to even gather data on gender diversity and gender diverse people?
That's a very good question, and it's a very it's a long-term project that the community, I guess, is looking for ways to undertake across lots of organisations. You know, for myself, I often draw parallels to the success of the marriage equality, you know, kind of advocates, and the way that telling stories to people one-on-one, connecting, building those kinds of bridges. There is a significant disconnect between the kinds of national and media coverage around trans people and the day-to-day lives across many, many areas. Alastair mentioned anti-discrimination issues to do with private schools. And as an example of the inconsistency and the problems with the law, you know, the Gender Centre frequently works with schools or in and around schools to support families. And we see the incredible support that comes from those families, from those school communities, to help and support trans and gender diverse young people, especially and their families. So on the ground level, people are people, and people understand how that works more or less, and that's kind of applicable across so many different areas. I mean, it makes me think, though, you know, we often work with families and the experience that families have of losing you know, kind of other family members and extended friends as well, because of the almost relentless barrage of negativity around all the various go-to issues in the media, whether that is Mackay's Baths, most recently, whether that's the Olympics around, you know, trans athletes, all of these different kind of issues. When you burrow down into them, you actually get the nuance and the complexity of the lived experience of being a trans and gender diverse person.
Thanks, Eloise. I'll just remind everyone that we do have the chat bar open. So if there's any questions that you'd like to pose to our panelists today, just put those in the chat bar, and we'll have time at the end to answer questions as well. So feel free to throw them our way. Alastair, just going back to that idea of updating or amending the Act, it's been over 20 years, nearly 25 years since the Law Reform Commission made recommendations. Those were not implemented. So it's been a really, really big gap in time, I suppose. What's the holdup? Is there not a desire to make these changes? Is it too difficult? What's the kind of process, if you could break that down a little bit for people who don't really understand how we can make amendments to acts like this?
Sure, and again, it's probably a bit to unpack with that question. Obviously, as an ordinary act of parliament, it's up to a member of parliament to introduce a bill, get it passed by both houses and be implemented. In our system of government, this bill in particular, because it can be quite controversial, it's only ever going to be really a government bill introduced by the Attorney General to make comprehensive change to the Act. Unfortunately, what we've seen since the introduction of trans protections in 1996 and sexual harassment in 1997 is a series of successive Attorneys General in governments, Labor and Coalition, who have, I would say, shirked their responsibility to make those amendments to ensure that the Act kept pace with the society it's supposed to protect. Now, there are multiple possible reasons for that. We talked earlier the fact that the Act represents values in our society, and for some people, some organisations, including certain religious organisations, their value is that they want to be able to continue to discriminate against LGBT people and others in daily life. Another value that can tend to be prioritised is for employers who don't want to be caught up in red tape. I would say that those values are wrong and don't reflect the majority of the population and the fundamental right for people to live their daily lives free from discrimination. But as I said, successive Attorneys General have chosen not to address it, and by kicking the can down the road, it actually becomes a bigger problem. So by not acting for 5 years and then 10 years, the Act falls further and further behind the values of our society. And I have some sympathy for the current Attorney General, Leon Marks Speakman, who has been left with this mess. I suspect he realises that this Act is the worst anti-discrimination law in the country, but I suspect he also realises that it would be a significant reform effort to bring it up to a standard that's fit for the 2020s. What we are trying to do at PIAC through the report leader to Laggard is draw attention to the many, many ways in which it falls short as a document from its lofty goals, and to call on the Attorney General to start the process to reform. So by having a comprehensive review into all its many problems and what needs to be done to fix it, and then committing to actually fixing it. So a review is great, but as we saw in the late 1990s with the Law Reform Commission report, you can have lots of lovely recommendations, but if they're not implemented, it doesn't help anyone. And on the flip side, what we don't need is further piecemeal reform. So tinkering with this Act isn't going to help us because it's so broken. It's so broken in who it protects. It's so broken in terms of its exceptions. It's so broken in terms of people with disabilities' right to participate in society, sexual harassment. Even its content and its language is broken. So the structure of the Act is very, very old-fashioned, perhaps reflecting its age, and I'm allowed to say that because I'm about the same age as the Act. But it kind of defines and provides its protections in different parts. So each attribute has a different part of the Act, the areas where they're protected and the exceptions. And so there can be really slight inconsistencies in each of those sections, whereas most modern Acts have one list of protected attributes, one list of the defined areas, one list of the exceptions that apply, and that actually removes those inconsistencies. And it's out of date in terms of its numbering. So for most people, if they opened the Anti-Discrimination Act, they probably wouldn't be able to find where they're protected because it's been piecemeal, because it's an old structure and things have been added over time. So you get something like the definition of what constitutes racial discrimination is in section 7, but the definition for what constitutes age-based discrimination is in section 49ZYA. And you have to be able to navigate that to understand your rights. And this is an act which should serve everyone, so everyone should be able to understand it. It really, really needs comprehensive review.
Thanks, Alastair. One of the things that kind of surprised me was that the kind of burden of proof, I suppose, of bringing a complaint against someone is really on the person who has been discriminated against, and you know, that really amplifies the kind of power imbalance, I suppose, in a lot of these situations. Quite often, the person who's being discriminated against is already someone who is vulnerable in society, and the kind of pressure to then bring something formal forward to challenge an employer or someone in a position of greater power is quite a challenging situation.
Absolutely. That's one of the limitations of a lot of anti-discrimination laws, but there are things that you can do to overcome that. You can change the burden of proof in terms of once a complainant makes a prima facie case, the burden is then on the respondent to show that discrimination hasn't happened. You can make representative complaints by organisations on behalf of individuals easier. You can make own motion investigations by Anti-Discrimination New South Wales into discrimination, either individual or systemic, easier. So there are things that you can do to overcome that, but none of those exist in New South Wales, really.
Well, we're coming nearly to the end of our time. I guess I just wanted to ask a kind of broader overarching question for you both. And I mean, do you think that the law or this act will eventually catch up to society and be reflective of the diversity in society today? You know, will we at some point in the near future see a society where everyone is offered equal protection under our laws, or is it too hard? Is it too complicated?
I'd like to jump in on this one. One of the things that the Gen Centre has been tracking for since 2019 is the death, the killing of Melody Bruno in Wagga. And this year the ABC did an examination of that process, and they found some questions that there were some issues around that are relevant to this conversation about anti-discrimination and the way that the courts have, you know, the processes that Melody's case went through. And it's these kinds of issues where there is a national or even an international event where it is that the questions that are being raised around the practicality of being able to even have, say, you know, to go to court and to, you know, to kind of have the actual court processes work in an adequate way. I think it's these kinds of moments. And I know from the trans community, when we saw what the processes that Melody's case went through, there was lots of anger within the community to ask, is this right? Is justice being served for Melody Bruno? So in those, my answer to that is to say that there's got to be a moment, there's got to be something that's going to cause it to catch fire and to change, whether it's Melody's case going forward or whatever it is. But it tends to be these kind of moments when people can see that the existing policy and legislation is very, very inadequate to the purposes, just even to keep people safe or to provide them the dignity that they deserve.
I might jump in on there and reiterate, I think it can. We can see an act brought up to modern standards. Obviously, it takes political will, and I don't know whether that exists or not. I hope it does, and I hope we can create that in the near future. But I think one thing we need to be aware of is that in the meantime, we're just falling further and further behind. So I think some people might have seen that this morning the Victorian government has reiterated its commitment to protect LGBT students and staff in religious schools against discrimination. New South Wales is now the only jurisdiction in the country that doesn't have either a process in place or a promise that will lead to the protection of LGBT students in religious schools. The home of Mardi Gras, in the future home of World Pride in 2023, in a place where people think, I would say perhaps erroneously, but like to think of the fact that Sydney is a progressive city, I think that's extraordinary, that there is no sign that LGBT kids going to school in Sydney right now will be protected at any point in the near future.
Thanks, Alastair and Eloise. Just a reminder, if you do have any questions, please pop them in the chat, because otherwise we might run out of time to be able to answer them. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining me today. It's been a really interesting discussion. I do have one question coming through now. Do you think the advent of social media has made it more politically difficult for governments to legislate to protect minority groups? That might be, I'll leave that for you guys to decide which one. Alastair, maybe.
Not necessarily. I think social media, it can be used for good, can be used for evil. I think it has contributed to some social movements and the push for change around Me Too, around marriage equality and other areas. I think social media is also the source or the site of different breaches of our Anti-Discrimination Act, so vilification and discrimination and bullying against other people. But I don't necessarily think it makes it more difficult for those changes to be made.
Great. A question from Jackie. What can individuals and communities do to pressure the government to change the legislation? Eloise,
that's a tough one. Yeah. Individuals, I guess. Whoa. So help me, Alastair, please, because that's a really tough question.
I think for individuals, there's definitely right to your local MP, right to the Attorney General, right to the Shadow Attorney General, the Premier, the Opposition Leader, to let them know that you think the Anti-Discrimination Act is no longer serving the community that it's supposed to. It's no longer meeting our values. It's no longer protecting the vulnerable against discrimination, and it needs to change.
Yeah.
We've got a nice comment from someone. Rachel has sent in, thank you for your session today. Change is still needed to make it clear, fair and trustworthy, which I think is a really good, good observation. Well, I might just do a little summary. This is obviously part of our History Reflected online talks that happen every Thursday at 4 p.m. So please tune in next week if you're interested in reflecting on the Sydney Olympics, because we've got a really great talk by Martin Killian about the Sydney Olympics. And you can tune in every Thursday at 4 p.m. to learn a little bit more about those 25 items from the History Reflected exhibition. And if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about the current research of the curators at Sydney Living Museums, we hold a Discover SLM talk every Tuesday at midday about various things that the curators have been working on. So you can also find out details about that on our website. If no more questions are going to come in, then I might again thank you, Alastair, and thank you, Eloise, for a really engaging discussion today. And I do appreciate your time. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.